Hello, I'm Des Birkinshaw.
And I'm Mark Hooper.
This is Without the Beatles, the podcast. Welcome to another episode. This is episode 3, I think. Terry Gilliam from Monty Python. We're very lucky because we also managed to get to interview Michael Palin as well. I did say in the trailer for Without the Beatles, a lot of people would probably think, oh, the Beatles and Python connection is that George Harrison funded Life of Brian, but it goes far deeper than that. I would always have interviewed them, but the person who said, well, you know who you got to speak to? You must speak to the Pythons because comedy in the 60s absolutely is dependent. And that was David Attenborough. So David Attenborough said to me, you must do the Pythons.
Yeah, I think this is one of my favourites we've done so far. It's like, I love Terry Gilliam. It's just the way he kind of, sort of avuncular sort of character is in the, the reason he came over to England in the first place was, the thing that people probably don't fully appreciate is that he came here because of the Beatles.
Yeah. Well, he can tell you about that. I think it's in the episode. We've got a longer version on Patreon, so if you do want to go and hear the rest of it. But talking about going to New York as a teenager, when the Beatles landed in New York with his 16mm camera, there's so many residences there, and seeing a curtain twitch in one of the rooms, and he said, that must be John Lennon. Anyway, we don't like to waste time. Terry Gilliam, part 1.
Enjoy.
Terry, hi. I ask everyone the same question. Can you imagine the world without the Beatles? If not, why not?
Well, my world would be not quite the world it is now without the Beatles because of George Harrison and the money he provided to make Life of Brian and then the company we created called Handmade. And then that led to him putting money into Time Bandits. And that led to Brazil and on and on. So I would be... nothing if it wasn't for the Beatles.
I doubt that. We can come to the rest of your career later, but I'm just wondering if we went back to 1964 when the Beatles first invaded America. Where were you then? What were you doing? And when you first heard them, what impact did it have on you?
Well, actually, in '64, it was actually earlier when the Beatles made their real impact, because I remember hearing I Want to Hold Your Hand. I was in LA at the time. It's actually happened only a couple of times in my life. Once when I heard Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis, and this. It was like a complete musical change in my mind. A new world opened up. And I was really intrigued with him, and I became quite obsessed with him, even to the point of cutting my hair. But in '64, I was in New York. I remember going up Park Avenue on the back of a friend's motorbike, because it was our way to get between the crowds being held back by the horses.
Wow.
And the hotel across the street where the Beatles were. And I've got a 16mm camera, and I've got film of windows in I think it's called the Regency Hotel, windows with curtains being pushed aside, which surely it was John Lennon pushing that curtain aside or something. The crowd was going crazy. I mean, I've got shots of all these girls suddenly pushing across the barriers, horses going mad as the girls were trying to rush across Park Avenue. Even get close.
It was a strange moment in cultural history. I was interviewing Steve Van Zandt from Bruce Springsteen's band, and he was saying that the thing for him was that the first time he heard I Want to Hold Your Hand, it was like a spaceship landing, and it had this huge impact on him. One day there's no band in America, next day there's 1 million bands because of the Ed Sullivan performance, this really big impact on young people.
I don't know, for me, it kind of, I'd always been a bit of an Anglophile, but it seemed to open a whole new world of England. I mean, Strawberry Fields, these worlds, Penny Lane, they were magical stories in song. And it was about atmosphere and attitudes, all the lonely people. This was like, whoa, this is not America. This is a very different thing. Because I'd loved Ealing comedies and the Goons. So there was a kind of zany humor that I always liked. But then this other post-Empire England that seemed to be coming alive. And it was the lure. I mean, ultimately, it's the lure that drew me over here. I mean, I remember sitting in LA up in Laurel Canyon and listening to each album, which each album was kind of a disappointment because it wasn't like the last album, so it'd take me many listenings to become obsessed by it. Started growing my hair long, getting stopped by the cops at night, and because long hair, driving a Hillman Minx. These are the things that I have to blame the Beatles for.
Yeah. I mean, I'm aiming to avoid mythology, but, Mary Quant said that she thought all contemporary people, the children of the Beatles, that's their legacy. It's about the meritocracy. It's about being creative. People like me who grew up on a council estate, I'm sitting here today doing a documentary. That's a very post-Beatles world. It's not by someone who went to public school and it's all controlled tightly in London. Has there been a democratization of art and attitudes and stuff, which you can trace back to there? What do you think?
To be honest, you can't blame the Beatles for all of that. I mean, everything was going on. Swinging London was happening, but the Beatles were so central to it all. And I mean, I remember, when they came to America, the Stones were, there were those who loved the Stones, but they weren't the Beatles. Herman's Hermits were actually bigger than the Stones in America for a brief moment, and then Dave Clark 5. But it was always the Beatles who seemed to be leading the way. They were the ones that were on the next step. Well, people were still, like the Stones were back on, doing blues still. Beatles had moved on from the blues. And I thought that was what was intriguing. You kind of felt they were the explorers, and we were on the journey with them. But they were always there ahead of us. And I used to get very envious of them because they had the money and the success to be able to go to exotic places and do exotic things. And I was still busy trying to make a living.
Probably still, yeah. Well, how much of your rebelliousness, your creativity, do you think comes from the 60s as such? What would you say about that? It was a fertile time.
A lot of people were younger. I mean, I'm actually the same age as the Beatles. That was the thing. I mean, I think John and I would have been almost the same year. It was, the rebelliousness was there because we'd all come through, my family were just working class family, but they got me into college and I got to go to a smart college. And then you get educated, and then you see a system that is irritating because there's so many things wrong in it. In America, we had more to get, in some ways, angry about because, the civil rights movement was much stronger in America. Women's lib was probably going on in America more powerfully than here, England. But the Beatles somehow, I don't know. For me, they weren't the only voice. That was the thing, is they were the one that I probably enjoyed the most because here were four guys who had all very different attitudes. That's where Richard Lester came to show us these four different characters. And people would identify with them. That's what really intrigued me, how we all took sides. I mean, it was John that I was the one most interested in John's sort of intelligence and his satirical attitude, his mocking voice. What always intrigued me. But I do remember how George always, in the first film, Hard Day's Night, there was something interesting about it because it was clear that John and Paul were the front men and Ringo was the clown. It was like, but George was this quiet one who wasn't so quiet. He was funny. And he intrigued me. And it was only till years later when I got to know him that I realized what was going on there. But I suppose you took sides even within the group. I mean, it wasn't just between the Beatles and the Stones. It was once you're involved in the Beatles, who is it? Which is the one? Which is my guy? I thought that was intriguing. And the only one I'd never met was John. And he was the one that I thought I was most like. But rebelliousness was in the air everywhere because it was a time for change because the 50s, the war had been survived. Those who had survived the war created a kind of solid, stable, stodgy world that functioned and everybody was very dutiful and did their jobs. And then along came this next generation that had the money and the education and the desire to say, let's tear it all down and see what happens.
What's interesting to me is that the biggest American band of all time, and at that time, was the Beach Boys. What do you think the difference was between the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and why did the Beatles win that kind of social attitude battle?
It's so weird. They start with the same three letters, then go different directions. I grew up in California, so the Beach Boys were interesting to me because all the jocks, all the surfers, and the blonde, beautiful guys were getting the girls. So I, at times, got really angry with the Beach Boys because they were encouraging the wrong kind of man. And because these guys were succeeding. And I remember being at the Monterey Pop Festival, and the Beach Boys came on stage, and they were not quite booed, but they were the past. And all that was going on at the Monterey Pop Festival was, the Beatles here. Is John here? John's here. Somebody's here. And it was quite amazing how the change had happened. And the Beach Boys felt old and the past in a kind of naive California, the sun is always shining attitude, where the Beatles brought in darkness and grayness and strangeness, then obviously drugs. I always found it was interesting at a time it was who was leading who, but I do think the Beatles were always just slightly ahead. It was like the drug culture would be going on, but the Beatles would then take it to another level where it would reach a much larger group of people, for better or worse. But
yeah. Well, I think the Beatles become like avatars, or they advertise everything they touch. So that was the interesting thing to me. So someone obviously introduced them to drugs, and it's not like they weren't around them or anything, but ultimately they do stupid things like Paul doing his interview saying, I've taken LSD. And there must have been a million people who thought, well, if Paul did it, he's still alive, I can. I mean, if Beyonce did that now, went on TV and said, hey, I did heroin or something because I thought I'd try it out, well, she'd be crucified, wouldn't she?
yeah, we're living in a different time, aren't we? I mean, that's what I despise the time we're living in because it's so anal. It's so frightened. I mean, being a product of that time, it's like, what's happened to our world? You know, we were supposed to be changing it, my generation. We changed it on certain levels, and then it, as always, it contracts back into something so timid and frightened. And like Hunter Thompson said, we were riding the crest of a wave. And the Beatles were, I think that's why I think Richard Lester is really important in the thing, because the film, Hard Day's Night, Help is less important. Hard Day's Night was just like, wow, it just broke through things. And you'd never seen a film quite like that, where the guys could be the guys. On one hand, it felt like a documentary because we were there, but on the other hand, it was clearly not. But it captured this kind of freedom and intelligence. And I think that's what I got excited about. I couldn't wait to get to England, and I get to meet Richard Lester eventually.
I've interviewed Nancy Sinatra for this film, and she picked up on two things you've said already about women's lib and civil rights in the 60s. In fact, actually, did you see that letter that was once published about the Beatles touring America? Their contract stipulated they wouldn't play to segregated audiences. I thought that was quite interesting. Yeah, very interesting. But the other thing was that she said when she came over, she came from California, like you, in 65, just to see if she could meet the Beatles. And her and Lee Hazelwood came over and met them. And while she was there, she went shopping and went to Mary Quant's shop and bought a miniskirt. And then when she got back to LA and was photographed everywhere and caused a big storm, it was like the only reason she came over, though, was to meet the Beatles. And she said to me, why the hell would anyone have come to London from California in 65? It was kind of, well, it was just to hang out with the Beatles. It was awful, you know.
But it wasn't. That's what I think. I disagree with her, because I mean, there was this background of grayness, but there was this fashion show. I mean, it was a masquerade ball that was going on in London. I mean, I got here, and the first time I was here, it was the end of 64 into 65, and I just was blown away by it. I had a very romantic idea of London because it was informed by the Beatles, I'm afraid, and Dickens, and a few other people along the way. But it was like, oh, this is fantastic. Suddenly it's like I felt I was in a place that was real. It had reality. And it was a series of cliches. I mean, there were bowler-hatted, pinstriped gentlemen. That was the city. That was the bankers. That was the business. And over here was the future and freedom. And it was like a really simple world where everybody was wearing the right clothes to say, I am conservative, I am fantastic. And I just loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. The thing was, I was never as crazed as everybody else. I wasn't taking drugs. I wasn't doing any of those things. But I was allowed to experience a lot of it without having to pay the money or the ultimate cost.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I picked on the Pythons to be in Without the Beatles, and I've also spoken to Michael, is that came from David Attenborough, of all people. He said to me, you should look at Python, because I don't think they could have got together if it weren't for the Beatles. And he explained why, which was, well, let's say if you look back 10 years before, you've got Do Not Adjust Your Set. He said, look, the kids' programs, you've got Muffin the Mule, Andy Pandy. That was children's TV in Britain. He said, now look at Do Not Adjust Your Set, which is a program that even adults are watching. But it's the spirit of the 60s, and it's actually in a program. And of course, that's where many of you came together and did your first work together as a group. What's your thought on that now? I don't know if you know enough about British TV to comment on, for a start, on children's TV, but what was the kind of thinking going into Do Not Adjust Your Set?
Well, see, it was funny. Before I left the States, I was trying to do children's TV with Harry Shearer, one of the voices of The Simpsons, and an old friend of ours, Joel Siegel, who was ABC Good Morning America TV critic on ABC, and because what was going on in America, there was soupy sales on children's TV, interesting things happening. And when I got over here and I saw Do Not Adjust Your Set, because nobody was paying attention to children's TV is what it was, because it wasn't important, because it was Muff and the Mule and all those silly things. I didn't really know the English versions of, but they were similar to what was going on in America. And because nobody was paying attention, it was an intro into television, because you could sneak in under the radar and start doing work. And I was immediately attracted to it because it was funny, it was amusing, but it was also making points. And it had the Bonzo Dog Band in it. And there we go, them in some ways a side of the Beatles, an extension of the Beatles, just going more towards the surreal and the absurd. And the Beatles stopped there and the Bonzos continued. And there they were. So I was really delighted to get involved in it. But what was interesting is you end up with all these Oxbridge graduates sliding into that kind of entertainment. On the other hand, you've got John and Graham doing Frost. So they're on a slightly different level, but still they're in satire. And Mike Terry and Eric were doing children's TV. But it was just the same thing, just slightly different attitudes or angles of it. And I was lucky enough to meet Humphrey Barclay, thanks to John Cleese getting rid of me. And I trapped Humphrey, and he was a cartoonist, and he liked my cartoons and forced me on the others.
When you watch the clips of Do Not Adjust Your Set, the interesting thing to me is that it's black and white. It's psychedelia, but it's for children. It's complete. Anyone who dared to commission anything as crazy as that now would really struggle, I think.
Yeah, but what you realize is, the effect of Spike Milligan. And, his effect on the Goon. I mean, the Goon's effect on the Beatles. So you're going to make that, so the connections to the Beatles, again, become the middlemen of something, whether it's the drug culture going over there. There was the comedy culture and the absurd, surrealist comedy culture of the Goons and Spike Milligan. And so they picked up on that. And again, we see that in their films through Richard Lester. And I think back to the Running, Jumping, Standing Still film, directed by Richard Lester. Now, that film I remember seeing in America and just being blown away by it, because I thought, there's no rules anymore. We don't have to tell a story. We don't have punchlines. It's just funny things for the absurdness of it and the surrealness of it. I mean, that's one of the things that I was pushing on the others in Python was Ernie Kovacs, who they didn't know, but Ernie Kovacs way back in the late 50s and into the 60s was doing totally surreal television. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Goons and Lester hadn't seen a lot of that stuff, because it was nonsensical. It didn't have structure in the way we were used to seeing structure. And so all that came through, and then somehow being filtered through the Beatles and then into Python. The line is pretty clear. George Harrison always claimed that, the spirit of the Beatles went into Python, because when they quit, we began.
Yeah. That's always peculiar. And not just Spike. I think you'd have to look at Beyond the Fringe as well. That fell into the same category that what Peter Cook did. Yeah. I think it's three little things that happened in the 60s that all joined together.
You get Beyond the Fringe. What happened with Beyond the Fringe, because I was a big fan of it, and it was a big success in America. And then next year into New York comes the Cambridge Footlights Review, Cambridge Circus, with John Cleese, Graham Chapman, Bill Oddie, and all. And me, I was doing a humor magazine then, and I got John to be in a photo story, so we became friends. So that's the Beyond the Fringe route that brought John and me together, which then eventually, when I came to England, brought me into Mike, Terry, and Eric's side of things.
You've quoted George there, his famous quote about the spirit of the Pythons coming from the Beatles after they split up. Did he ever say that to you directly? Was that something you ever discussed?
No, I mean, I don't think he quoted it himself as precisely, but it was always clear. I mean, George, there was never any doubt. He thought exactly what they had been, that kind of chemistry and that combination of different energies. and an attitude towards the world, where theirs was through music, ours was through comedy. And he just, that was definite.
Yeah. I've always found it peculiar that those two big teams that made such a huge impact through the 60s and the 70s both come ostensibly from, good self-accepted, from Britain, but also that one finishes, one starts, and it's always with a bit of distance looking back. It's almost as if someone was writing that,
Yeah, I know. I mean, well, maybe there are forces behind events in the world. I mean, I just think there's streams of energy that you start riding, and somehow oof, they go like that. I mean, John Cleese would hate the idea. I mean, he was never much of a Beatles fan at all. He just thought these silly pop stars, was his attitude. Certainly, Mike, was on Ready, Steady, Go, I think, wasn't he? He was a music presenter. Eric always wanted to be a pop star. So those connections are there on many levels. I mean, when the musical aspect of Python is quite interesting. It's a general attitude, and there's a mixture of anarchy, there's pushing against the form, debunking hypocrisy, and all the things that we...
Yeah. Michael Palin said that he thought it was also about authorship and ownership of ideas. He saw them quite early on. He was telling me he saw them quite early.
Really?
Yeah, and he went all the way to Birkenhead because he was chasing some girl. And but him and Terry Jones both took some idea of you have to do it yourself, that you own things, that you author.
Yeah, well, I think we all felt that. I mean, that's all I ever wanted to do. I remember when I finally quit my last proper job at the Chevrolet assembly plant, I said, I'm only going to work for things I have control over. That's the only thing I will do, and I won't work for money. And I've held true to that rather well. I'm surprised.
Well, that is the decision we all have to make. I mean, my wife, Shazna, she probably hates me for it, but I've always chosen the path of what's interesting rather than just staying somewhere. And, some of that is from the Beatles, some of that's from Python. These two, they're formative influences on me, along with lots of other things. But the anarchy, the independence, I think I took from that, And I think ultimately you have to look at it and you go, well, you've only got one life. And sometimes things fall into place anyway.
But you do make your own luck and structure. I mean, you do make choices like that. And how do you approach life? Is it for me trying to express whatever it is that's unique about me and what I enjoy and where the pleasure comes from? Because the money, the money's very useful. And it's very hard for, that's what I love about George living in the material world. Trying to deal with the fact they're talking about free and all, but they're multi-millionaires. So it makes it easier. But nevertheless, it's how it worked. I mean, when you think about them, they came from, no money, but they did what they liked and they worked very hard at it and they succeeded. Now, there's a lot of other people that come from nothing, work very hard at it and don't succeed. I mean, because there are people that are more talented than others. There are people that are more lucky. All of those things happen. But it seems to me it's pointless to go the other route. I don't understand the other route, where if you work really hard and really careful and you keep things together and somehow this will make your life worth living. I just don't think playing it safe works. I mean, but it just may be that we are who we are. I mean, I don't think we have a choice in most of this stuff. I think very early on in life, you kind of make, okay, I am that, and this is the way I perceive the world and how I will approach it. And I hate encouraging my kids to do it because they may not be as talented as I was and they may have a miserable life. So I try not to encourage. I just do what I do and let the example be it rather than preaching.
Were you a big Terry Gilliam fan, Python fan?
Yeah, I am. And I'm a big fan. I know you love Brazil and you love the Time Bandits was massive when I was a kid. I remember watching that over and over again. But also Fisher King, I absolutely love. I think it's a really people always say undiscovered classic these days, and it just means a massive number one, which they've just found on Spotify. But it's genuinely, I don't think it got the appreciation. I think he got some awards for it, but I think in terms of his career, people kind of don't tend to mention that in the same breath.
Or 12 Monkeys. I love 12 Monkeys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
My daughter is a film student, and one of the first thing they were shown at the school was the making of The Man of La Mancha, the
Oh, yes.
disaster.
Yeah,
around that.
amazing. Yeah.
Like all the things that you should avoid when making films.
It's like it's so meta, that, isn't it? Like sort of the film that will never be made, and
Yeah.
sort of eventually making a film about how it will never be made.
So the two things that really influenced me when I was growing up with the Beatles and Python, both of them are a hugely diverse worlds that you can explore. So as soon as you discover the Beatles, then you've got John Lennon's solo catalogue. As soon as you discover the Pythons, you've got the Python solo catalogues. I got one out of the library, one of the albums, and I was listening to it. I was like, who's this Aristotle bloke then? I had to go and look him up. You know, what they did when they were doing that is broadening their audience's horizons.
Yeah.
And I think that was really important because I ended up studying philosophy actually for my sins, and I think some of that came from watching the brilliant Germans versus Greeks philosophers football match. When no one does anything, they all just walk around, the ball's still on the centre spot for 90 minutes, all walking around like this until Archimedes goes Eureka, and kicks the ball into the goal.
I don't think we've talked about this. I studied philosophy too.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I can't say it was entirely because of that sketch, but definitely, yeah.
It wasn't
Just
entirely.
open doors. It's like the Beatles, isn't it? They just open doors to things like, this is an interesting thing. If you're into it, maybe explore it a bit more.
My philosophy teacher said on the last, when we all graduated, he said, congratulations to a miserable world. And I said, how so? He goes, because you will realise most people talk nonsense, illogical nonsense. You will have two choices, be quiet and put up with it and be an outsider, or keep correcting them and be an outsider.
Yeah. Although sort of slightly conversely, I had an amazing tutor the first year, and he said, people have been studying this for thousands of years and no one's come up with the answer yet. That's why it's still in the philosophy category, rather than it's gone into another science. So if you don't understand anything, put your hand up, and you might think you're an idiot and everyone will groan and tut at you, but I guarantee they'll all write down the answer. There's not always an answer, but they'll all write down I tend to be slightly introverted in the way I sort of approach people when I first meet people. And I was like, day one, I just went, why do they do that? What does that mean? I don't understand. And again, it brings back the feels like inquiring minds. That's all that kind of...
Right. And we both became journalists.
Yeah, exactly.
So which in theory, when certainly maybe not now, but back then, the notion of becoming a journalist was about the idea of finding some kind of truth, holding people accountable, making people answer for their questions. And I was doing politics, so I was doing that. Yeah, I think that's all connected. I mean, you can't possibly... I mean, everyone else in my street was a bank robber.
Yeah.
Like everyone, like Terry Gilliam or like yourself or like me, or like the Swifties now, right? You're obsessed by something as a teenager, but then it leads you into other places. And then 30 years later, you can go, well, one of my formative influences was, it doesn't make you some kind of sad, over-obsessed fan. It means that you had a development period where you got something valuable out of it, as opposed to maybe some of the teenagers I meet now are spending an awful lot of time watching Cats or like funny memes, but there's not a lot of depth to that. So I do worry about what's going to happen to them. I'm sure they'll sort it all out, but that will be their influence. But anyway, I'm glad to have had Python as an influence. It's interesting, that whole thing about influence, because the next person we're going to talk about is you met Annie Shepherd. She was interesting. We'll talk about what you thought about her afterwards. But yeah. So let's have a look at Annie Shepherd's Beatles story.
So, Annie, we should probably just introduce yourself and explain what you do, because you've been involved quite a lot in helping to change the culture of businesses, haven't you, I suppose?
Well, helping to change the culture in the public sector. Although I worked for a little while in the private sector, but my career has been in the public sector. I've had 3 chief executive roles, 2 in local government, 1 in an independent company that then became owned by government. I've been really, really fortunate to have been given great opportunities in my career, and an OB to boot for my contribution to the climate agenda in the UK, and my passion to be involved in child protection for all of my career. The sort of late 50s, early 60s, I was coming into a culture where I was expected to get on with being a hardworking student at school. And then came the Beatles. And I can remember hearing the Beatles for the first time and jumping out of bed and thinking, what is this? It was just completely different from anything I had ever heard before. And one Christmas when I got a transistor radio, it meant I could go out with it and I could listen to music as I was walking down the road.
I guess also this idea, they showed there's a world of opportunity out there for young people, and with you being the first person going to further education in your family, I guess again that coincided with, you know, you can better yourself, you can explore new worlds.
You could see they were passionate about what they were doing. I was thinking about how hardworking they were, how dedicated they were, how determined they were. And I think that that influenced me, that nothing, it was sort of like nothing was going to come on a plate.
Yeah.
This sense of, there was no sense of entitlement. The Beatles were at the heart of that, and they were at the heart of a pride of Britain in a way. You know, they were doing something remarkable, and they were Brits.
Yeah.
You know, that was also part of it. Yeah. You know, society at the time when the Beatles, that osmosis of the Beatles hitting at the same time as the contraceptive pill, for instance, which gave women a new freedom. I mean, a freedom that they did not have before. And of course, initially, the contraceptive pill was only available to women who were married at the permission of their husband of a certain age. But of course, by the time I go to university, there is a new understanding of your career is going to get blighted if you get pregnant. And so the contraceptive pill became available. You know, important things were changing. Women having careers, women going into politics. I mean, things were changing dramatically. And I still say at this age, at the heart of it was music, dress, young people, the economy was changing. And again, at the heart of that drive was music and, you know, and suddenly you wanted to go to concerts. Seeing live music was really pretty important to young people. You got a sense when you watched them, they were a team. And they were a team of 4 individuals who were very different, but combined together, they were more powerful, the 4 of them, as they were as individuals.
Yeah, yeah.
And that, I think, is the other thing that I've sort of learned in my career. Yes, of course, they raised in people the possibility I could do something with my life as well. You know, people were thinking differently, and they were personifying that difference of thinking differently, doing differently, and actually don't have a care in the world. Get on with it. You know, do what you need to do. Freedom is here. I didn't smoke. I was careful about drinking because my parents would not have liked it. And I got myself educated about birth control so that when the right boy came along, I was ready.
Paul McCartney.
It wasn't Paul McCartney, no, unfortunately, but no.
Came close though.
I wouldn't have been right for him.
It's about opening a mind. So this is literally what we talk about in this episode, you know, how an early influence can open your mind. And Annie said that it made her dance. Even though she's retired, she's still dancing. She brought the terpsichore into her, the muse into her life, you know, the Beatles did. So back to Terry, because this is what he's going to talk about in part 2, actually. I think what he's concerned about is the state of things. And so he's talking about the impact of social media, people being deprived of interesting source material.
There's 2 sides to it because all information is there on the internet. So if you're interested in something, you can find and dig deeper. But it's just that, you know, sometimes social media just makes you focus on the surface and not go beyond. You know, like you say, just, you know, you find another cat meme rather than sort of finding anything. Who knows? There might be a cat meme sketch about philosophers, and then you discover philosophy like we did.
Journalists in particular get a bad name, but actually, when you were, you know, so you were where? Give us a.
I started off sort of freelancing for the Face magazine, and that led to a job at Arena, which was kind of sister or kind of, I guess, sort of big brother magazine associated with Face. It's all the same staff and people who sort of felt like they'd grown up a little bit. So they don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's kind of slightly different audience. And then from there, I went to ID magazine there for about 5 years. So it was all kind of starting off writing about music specifically, and then it broadened out more into popular culture. I like that, the Face particularly, and they had this brilliant kind of methodology where it's the why, not the what. So it's like, we don't care what's number one or what the best film is, what's in the book. It's like, why is this interesting? Why is there 5 zombie films going on, or why is everybody concentrating on this? So I think that was ingrained in me quite early on. Is like, like we're saying, dig a little bit deeper, find out what the story is here, rather than just saying this song is popular. Everybody knows that, but what's going on behind the culture.
I had quite a few dealings over the years, not for a while actually, but with Michael Rosen. And one of the things I remember sitting with him in the South Bank, we were doing something, and I said, well, I'm very worried. I've got a 3-year-old, about school, don't worry about school. School's just something you have to get through. Love, art and boundaries, and you'll be fine. Look, we've gone through a period now in history and education where what used to happen was you would read someone The Princess and the Pea, and say, what's the moral of that story? Which is like, don't be too high and mighty, we're all human, whatever. When they do exams now, it'd be like, what was the vegetable underneath the mattress? Right? Which is exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
And you learn nothing from that. So you've got to be able to delve and analyze and things like that. And I don't know if you've encountered this when you're talking to people about Without the Beatles, because, it's like, oh, there's talking about the Beatles again. But the longer I've gone on, the more I've realized how interconnected they are to everything that else goes on. And what's fascinating to me is like that does bear some analysis, because it's actually a much deeper thing than you think it is. It's not just those 4 individuals. It's not that. It's the impact of all of it, the social change. Yes, of course, music and everything, but what they enabled by accident, like they were not aware of it, right? They're just making music.
Yeah.
But what they did was actually change the mindset of people. We can go into this later on, but there's a brilliant thing. I spoke to a guy, he's a writer, Rory. He wrote a book about the first Silk Road trips where people were doing that. And I haven't got the figures in front of me, but listen, this is actually true. So what he did was he looked into the number of visas issued in India. So it's 1966. No one's talking about India really, apart from, George starting to use his guitar, but the Beatles haven't gone to Rishikesh yet. India issued something like 10,000 visas a year, 10,000 to India. These were very intrepid people, probably a lot of young people following in the footsteps of the beat poets and things like that, who'd already made that journey. And some who were already inspired, but mostly business people and expats going to do business. And what he discovered was then immediately after Rishikesh, it goes up to 1 million. Wow. So 1 million visas. And of course, what they are, let's face it, is all young people from the West, and that includes Steve Jobs, it includes David Lynch, it includes lots of people like that who went in the Beatles' footsteps to go and what they come back with was a kind of taste of Eastern philosophy. So they think differently about the world, they think differently about the West, and that has permeated all the way through. You can't divorce it. So, in the end, Steve Jobs was saying the Beatles were like his business model.
Yeah.
Like you have to have a mentor, whatever. Yeah. David Lynch comes back. He's still running the David Lynch Foundation for Transcendental Meditation, which is in something like 1 million students a year in America get TM in school because of that. These are big impacts. And it's basically the 60s equivalent of Swifties.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing just thinking like, the way that the West has done things isn't necessarily, it's been so sort of ingrained before then, like we do everything right, this is the way it should be. And then just to put that little seed of doubt, like maybe there's another way of doing this. I think that's fascinating. And I think the Beatles helped open that up. So there's enough waffle from us. I think we need to hear a bit more from Terry.
Yeah. So Terry, part 2.
My contention is that the thing that Python will be most remembered for is Life of Brian.
Ooh.
What do you think?
I don't know. Will there be religion in 200 years? Maybe they won't know what it's about by then. Who knows? I think, Life of Brian is the one I'm proudest of in a sense, because I really took on important things, important material, important subject, and hit the nail on the head time and time again. I thought it was great. And wisely, of course, we didn't take on Muslims. This is my joke always. We stuck with the Christians and the Jews. Because, eventually the world of Islam will develop as fine a sense of humor as the Jewish world did. The Jews have been at it longer, that's it, and they really sussed out humor. Christians aren't there yet. And my strength of it is, I think Meaning of Life is a very uneven film, just very much like the television shows, but it has some of the finest stuff Python has ever done in Meaning of Life. Holy Grail is just funny. It's just quite wonderful how it sustains itself. But Brian is the one that is funny and wise and dangerous and does all the right things, despite the things that don't work in it. Because, Eric bottled out on Otto and his suicide squad of Jewish fanatics who are going to build Israel that'll last 1,000 years. I was so pleased with it. My Stars of David swastikas, I was very pleased with. That was about pushing it, because I loved the fact that Python pushed things. Because you don't know where the edge of the cliff is until you go there. You don't know what reactions are going to be until you go there. And I'm proud of Brian, because it was our best at pushing. And now nobody's pushing. Everybody's just taking sides and stopping thinking. I think Brian made people think about a lot of things. That was great.
Yeah, and things have changed. So there are comparisons. So if you start with John Lennon in 1966 saying accidentally the Beatles are bigger than Christ, he got roughly the same reaction you guys got in the 70s, which is, kind of debate level. We've only got forward to say Jerry Springer the opera, and suddenly you've got death threats against the producers from the Christians, let alone what happened with the Danish cartoons. So it's almost like there's a line of change that starts with like reasonable protest, but things do seem to have gone backwards now, I think.
But it also shows that there's always going to be those people out there that don't think, that just react. I mean, even before Python, even before the Beatles, when I was with Harvey Kurtzman doing Help magazine, at one point we had the Mona Lisa on the cover of the magazine, and I can't remember what we did with it. We made some sacrilegious, we just made a joke about the Mona Lisa. And we were inundated by death threats from right-wing Christians saying, that we were, it was blasphemous. It was the Virgin Mary there, and we were making fun of her. I said, what are you talking about? It's the Mona Lisa. But it didn't matter. They were ready to start the death threats. So it didn't surprise me when, the Beatles got it, when Salman Rushdie gets it. There's going to be always a great chunk of the world out there that are stupid, ill-informed, and angry, and want to do evil, and it is evil to people who might make you think.
I've always wondered what would happen if Life of Brian come out now. What do you think in terms of reaction?
If Life of Brian came out now, I have no idea. America's become so right-wing, we'd probably get burnt. It's what angers me about the world we're living in now, is that everybody's retreating into prejudice and narrow-mindedness is what's going on now. In a sense, that's what I find really depressing, having come through the 60s and 70s and watched imagination and the willingness to explore the world and all the possibilities, all that flowering, and then to be reduced to this thing. It's like we're heading back towards the bit before the Big Bang. As the universe has expanded, now it's going back. It's getting nastier and nastier until it's this tiny, nasty little ball of people who no longer think anymore, and then it'll explode again. But we're in the retrograde moment, and it really bothers me.
Yeah, me too. Okay, old story. How important was George Harrison to the making of Life of Brian?
George Harrison. I remember I actually told him, I think, I'm glad I bought all those Beatle albums when I was young, because I didn't realize I was financing my future. But thank you. George was the key to, me sitting in this house right now. Whatever Python had done, it was getting Life of Brian made. And again, it comes through a series of things. I remember because Eric Idle and I were out in LA promoting Holy Grail, and we said, George Harrison in town, he'd love to have dinner. And we all got together and we met George for the first time. And it's like, this is fantastic. And I think Jim Keltner was there. I'm pretty sure it was Jim Keltner was there, who turned out to have gone to high school with Carol Cleveland. And these circles keep closing up. And so we became friends of George. Now, Eric maintained that friendship more vigorously than the rest of us did. And it was that point we discovered George was the biggest Python fan on the planet. It used to be embarrassing. He would, in the middle of conversation, quote a punchline or a line from something, and I didn't know what he was talking about. And of course, it was something from Python. So we became friends. And when EMI pulled out at the 11th hour and 59 minutes, Life of Brian, Eric approached George, and then George went to his manager, and boom, boom, boom. And off we went, and suddenly Life of Brian was made. And from that came handmade films.
Yeah. It's often quoted that George mortgaged his house to Life of Brian. Is that true?
No, it wasn't his house. It was their office building in Cadogan Square in Knightsbridge, much more valuable. No, it wasn't his house, but they mortgaged, yeah. I think what was very interesting is the way it worked. We learned a lot about money during those days with George and Dennis, because if you've got a Beatle, the assumption is there's a fortune there, and money, just money's a magnet for other money. And that was very useful. I mean, what was interesting about how little money George had when he met Dennis, who became his manager, and shocking that a Beatle could only have a few £100,000. This is not possible. These people deserve all the money on the planet, and one assumes that. But it was, George and Dennis, went and got the money, and we made Life of Brian, and that was really important. It was also getting to know George more during that period. It was nice, and seeing him at times, like when we were cutting the movie, and then he would come to a meeting after we'd had a screening and realize that we were all arguing with each other. And he didn't want to know that. He kind of wanted us to be a group that was harmonious, unlike the Beatles. And I thought that was really sweet that he admired us that much and thought we would be, in a way, a more idealized version of how a group could function. It wasn't true.
Yeah. Of course, the truth is that both with the Beatles and Pythons, it's arguing that makes a product so good in the end.
That was the strength of it. I mean, and that's...
Yeah, it's different if you're living it in reality, I suppose. That's the difference.
No, I think I kind of missed the fights with Python, because when we went back and did something for the 30th anniversary of the BBC, we all were jolly chaps enjoying each other's company, and it was crap.
You can't win. Now, one of the things we have been doing, obviously, Without the Beatles, is we're looking at that 6 degrees of separation. And often we all take our CVs for granted. So you get your first job, that leads to your next job. You can't have got your second job without your first job. And obviously 6 stages down the line, you couldn't have had your latest, greatest job if you hadn't have had that first job. And it does require things to fall out that way. Yeah. It's that kind of free will determinism thing. But I'm guessing without Life of Brian, there's no Handmade. Without Handmade, there's no Time Bandits.
Well, no, totally. I mean, that was the whole thing. Is once Python and George became handmade films needed to make movies. And here was 6 guys all wanting to either write or perform or something. And my first project was Brazil. And Dennis, nobody had any interest in it. So out of desperation, one weekend I sat down and came up with this idea of a kid and 6 little people traveling through time and space. Then went to Mike, and we wrote it, and the film was made. And then what was interesting about Time Bandits is, well, we had finished the script. Dennis went out to America, and nobody wanted the script. Okay, so now we make the movie, and we make the movie because George and Dennis put up the money again, and then the film is finished, and Dennis goes out to sell it in Hollywood. Nobody wants it. So once again, George comes to the rescue and guarantees the prints and ad $5 million. And then the film opened in America and went to #1, and it's still, and actually, box office wide, it's still the biggest I've ever done in America. And everything that I've done subsequently as a result of that.
So of course, at the time, there weren't that many British film companies being successful at the time. There were only a couple, and they weren't having, a huge impact. I just wonder now, what's your take on the success of Handmade? What made it successful? How important was it to the British film industry? And if you think about that, who were the people you trained up, who were third assistant directors, whatever, that benefited?
I don't know if Handmade really had a great impact, other than the fact that it did provide work for people. Films got made. But even when it was happening, I always felt it was slightly outside, because it was a self-contained world. Nevertheless, you look at the films that got made and got released through it. I mean, Long Good Friday, Handmade didn't make it, but they somehow helped get things out there. So I'm very bad at judging the impact of anything that I or those around me was involved with. I remember years ago reading a book on British films in the 70s and 80s. There was a lot of history. And Python was a footnote. It was like it was Alexander Walker wrote it.
National Heroes, that one.
And yeah, exactly. We were like a footnote. That's all we were. Where if I go to somewhere like Brussels in Belgium, we were the 70s as far as British film, as far as the rest of the world was concerned. But within this little island, we were nothing, according to the professionals, people who really understand about films and filmmaking.
That's bollocks. From the first time we had a VHS, you know, it was, I could tell you all the films we watched, and it would have been from Private Function to The Life of Brian, The Holy Grail, whatchamacallit?
With Nell and Wyatt.
With Nell and I, all kinds of things. And they were like real viewing sessions.
But there's this thing about comedy. I mean, that it's not not serious filmmaking. Is the way comedy is perceived, and there's nothing. The world isn't going to change. I mean, in fact, the public likes it. It's probably even more irritating to serious film lovers. But no, Handmade. I don't know. It seems to me Handmade has more of a reputation now, in retrospect, than it did at the time. Is what it feels like to me. It was going on. It existed. You know. The idea of Beatle involved already sort of lowered the tone a bit. And then Python's, the tone was even lower.
Yeah.
I think, but that's how I think it was perceived.
Well, it's quite outrageous. You've only got to look back at it from now, and we're talking 20th century contributions to culture. You can't get much bigger than the Pythons and the Beatles.
Yeah.
And they've
In a
lost
sense,
it.
I kind of like the fact that it was never totally accepted as being high art. I think it's good. I mean, it's like me and comic books. I like them because they're slightly outsider. They're lower brow art, which is probably the more important stuff. Because, I mean, now comic books have taken over Hollywood.
Yeah.
And I don't like those films because they're not what comic books were about.
No, not me.
They become just big, fluffy things with lots of noise. The stuff that really changes society, that makes a difference, that I like. I mean, we've been, I think, lucky, and I think the Beatles were lucky because changed society and had the benefit of making good money at the same time, which is a rare combination. That's really nice. There was a problem with handmade film, and I think it's worth talking about, is Dennis O'Brien, who was George's manager, became Python's manager, and he was a very clever lawyer and business guy, and he could work money in all the magic of money, which none of us are good at. Because of Life of Brian and in Time Bandits, Dennis began to think he was as creative as the creative people, and this happens all the time. But we had it on a very small scale, and he started then interfering in the next film. So when along comes Privates on Parade, they have the rights to it, and he wanted it to be a Python film with all the Pythons involved playing all the parts. Well, that's not what happened, and it ended up John Cleese being in it with Dennis Quilley playing the main character. So they do the film, they make it, and in the editing, Dennis discovers it seems to be about gays in the military. And they decide, this is not going to work. And so he spends his time re-editing the film, doing all the things that Hollywood was, we hated Hollywood for doing. Putting John Cleese's character almost as the main character and cutting the real story down. So suddenly Handmade Films is behaving like a Hollywood studio and ruining decent films. David Leland had the same experience with Handmade Films because Dennis, the money wizard, thinking he's creative. It got really ugly, and I think it was difficult for George because George didn't want to be hands-on. He wanted to give people the freedom to do what they would, and yet it was being countermanded by Dennis all the time. So in the end, whatever Handmade did, it kind of fell apart because of that kind of interference. If Python had stayed involved, it might have been different, but Python pulled out fairly early on because, again, this expanding company, once you go from production, we have to get into distribution so we can control everything. And then with distribution, you need more product, you need films. So Dennis brings on a very experienced guy from the business, and he starts buying in these crap horror films from America. And that's when we left. We said, we don't want to be involved in a company that's doing that kind of work, and we left. So George was kind of left on his own, to be quite honest, and the Python connection carried on with individuals, basically John or Mike, doing films, but it hurt what could have been a great company.
Because it was a very personal decision for George to come in and bail out Life of Brian.
Yeah.
I wonder, did you take it personally when something like Meaning of Life didn't happen at Handmade?
No, I don't think he did. No, because he wasn't like that. No, he was just, whatever we wanted to do was fine. And there was still, stuff. Mike was still doing stuff, and John was doing stuff at Handmade. But no, I don't think so. I think he was saddened, definitely, when Python pulled out, and I warned him. I said, Dennis is the problem, but having survived and the ups and downs of the Beatles with various managers and being screwed financially in many, many ways, he just couldn't separate until much later, and then it became very ugly.
Mm-hmm. Well, your next project, of course, was Brazil, which you offered to Handmade, and you went elsewhere with famously mixed results. But I was wondering, the CV idea, how important was it in getting Brazil off the ground that you had done Jabberwocky, you had done Holy Grail, you had done Life of Brian? Did they act as your passport, your ticket into Hollywood?
The real entree to Hollywood was Time Bandits, because Hollywood, whatever you've done before, I mean, with Holy Grail and with Life of Brian, we were successful to only a certain degree. But at least we were known. We knew people out there. Connections had started being made. It was Time Bandits because it did so well at the box office. That's what changed everything. And then I existed as separate from Python. And then you go to Hollywood, and then they start offering you all of those big A-list Hollywood movies, and then you start turning them down because that's not what you want to do. Because we've been trained through Python and the Beatles to plow one's own furrow through life and maintain control and do what we want to do. And it's once this thing, and it's not really an ego, but there's a kind of arrogance you develop because my mistakes are going to be more interesting than their mistakes. And so one tries to protect the uniqueness of whatever it is. And at a certain point, all of us, whether you're Beatles, whatever, you become, an entity that's reasonably experienced, has clearly got a bit of talent, and has a fan base out there. So that's where you want to expend your energies, down those roads, and that's what Brazil was. And so I ended up by saying no to all of these Hollywood big budget movies. They took an interest in this movie that I wanted to do. So clearly, if I was turning those down, this one might have been might be even more interesting. So we ended up doing it. But it was, again, stepping outside the system and working with a pirate, basically, Arnon Milchan, the producer. And it was always much more fun going down these dangerous roads with people who are willing to swash and buckle and do whatever you need to do to make a movie and laugh about it while you're doing it. That's the important thing.
Well, you say laugh, but Brazil, of course, was the film where you become embroiled in the most terrible conflicts with the money and the studios, and you have to fight, to get your cut of the film out, really, really hard. And I wonder if, looking back on it now, does that represent any kind of watershed in the way that film companies deal with artists, or is it plus ça change?
I don't know. Brazil was, we managed to get the money to make it. We ended up with two studios, Fox for the world and Universal for America. Fox released the film in the rest of the world. We then show it to the boys at Universal, and they say, it's unreleasable, it's unwatchable, it doesn't make any sense. And on the other hand, they could see it's quite an extraordinary film with a lot of potential if molded by the right hands. And so they said, you need a happy ending on this thing. You've got to do this. And I said, sorry, we've gone to all this trouble to make this. I mean, there was the script at the beginning, we all agreed to tell. And for me, it's about storytelling. And if that was the story you're telling and everybody agreed to make that story, why now are we changing the story? Because we might make more money. Oh, that's why we're changing the story. And I said, no. And they then stopped film being released. They were recutting the film. There was an embargo on even showing my version of the film. And so it's warfare. And there's two ways you can approach war. You can do it, with two big armies, or you can be like the Viet Cong and hide in the trees. And so I said, well, it's got to be done with humor. So I take out an ad in Variety. Bought a whole page I did. And it just said, "Dear Sid Sheinberg," who was the head of the studio, "when are you going to release my film, Brazil?" Signed Terry Gilliam. Just a personal statement there in the middle. And it was like, and the shit hit the fan, because you don't do that in Hollywood. And but it got the press's attention, and then once the press is involved, at a good time. So a dialogue was conducted between me and Sid, even though we never spoke, by a journalist who would say, "Terry said this. What do you have to say, Sid?" And then he'd say, "Sid said this, Terry. What do you have to say?" And on it went. And I was always making jokes and making it fun. He was speaking with the weight of corporate responsibility on his shoulders. And it was, and the public can see very quickly what's going on here. And this, we waged war for a very long time until we managed to have a lot of clandestine underground screenings for the Los Angeles critics. And they discovered that they could vote on the film even though it hadn't been released. And suddenly there we were, Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay for a film that hadn't been released. That's not happened.
But in the end, was that a help or a hindrance? Because now, of course, you're Terry Gilliam, the pain in the arse.
Yeah, no, it's a double-edged sword. That's all it is. All good swords are double-edged as far as I'm concerned. And so on one hand, I beat the studio system. Ta-da! So on one hand, I'm a hero. People were calling me, every writer saying, "God, good for you." It's given me hope. So all the creative people, this is fantastic because it gave them hope to be dashed later, of course. But that was it. The studio, of course, said, "This guy's trouble. This guy's trouble." And so I've had my ups and downs because of that. I mean, years later, when I'm coming around to do 12 Monkeys, I'm meeting at Claridge's breakfast with the head of the studio, and he's got a copy of the Battle of Brazil book with him. And I thought, well, at least is intelligent enough to try to find out who this, quote, troublemaker is. And we ended up making a film. It was a huge success, and everybody's happy.
I mean, I think of Munchausen. When that was being made, the press was full of reports, about how badly it was going. But I love it. I think it's a flawless film. I love it from beginning to end. Have done since the day I first saw it in the cinema,
Sony now agree with you because they released a Blu-ray anniversary edition. And that's why it continues the Beatle experience. I mean, when you actually, and John, I suppose, is the one I've become like that in the sense that I'm the big mouth. I'm the guy that's saying these things, getting in trouble. And that's absolutely fine and dandy. And when he said he was, the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, it was a statement of fact. It had nothing to do with any other than fact. It was also very funny. And he knew he was going to get in trouble. But if nobody's being the troublemaker, the gadfly, the pusher of the limits, the world just shrinks again. And those guys, in all different ways, I mean, I suppose Paul was the least interesting one to me because he was the most, he was the one that wanted to be loved in a sense. Where George was out on a spiritual path, but which sounds really boring and dull and miserable, but it wasn't at all. It's full of laughter and funny, and he's the most sardonic person I've met, and he could take the piss out of his spirituality 24 hours a day, and yet it never detracted from a true sense of a spiritual nature that was going on there. And John was, bashing and crashing and making these huge events out there. And some of them were tedious and boring, and Yoko's influence, I think, became really silly, but it didn't matter. They were doing it, and people had to pay attention. And I think it's the thing that when I look back and I think, God, nobody's doing that now. I mean, I would love to be the Beatle fan I was again, looking at somebody else doing these outrageous things, getting away with it, and making all the right noises, because they're the noises that cause things to happen, to encourage others, to make you look at the world freshly.
he did nothing in that interview to make me not love him.
Exactly. I just want to, like, you know, you got to hang out in his house. I was just thinking, like, I just wish I was just sitting there with him and just, like, you know, hang around afterwards and have a cup of tea.
I'll tell you one thing about his house. I remember him telling me that he goes, "See that piano there? That was Roger Waters' piano. I bought it off him." I was saying, "Wait, do you still need it?" You know. Yeah, but he did keep it, unfortunately. No, he's absolutely fascinating, and he is your classic 60s man. So full of ideas, a total Renaissance man. You know, will be able to talk eloquently about painting, art, music, philosophy, obviously filmmaking, etc. And it's all, you know, fairy tales and stuff, you know, and it's all like melded into one thing, which creates his own new output. And it's a beautiful output.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that sort of generation of people who can just quote things off the top of the head, which I've never been able to do. And it's just putting those connections, but being able to, like, quote a snippet of a poem and explain how that links to something else. And it kind of flows so eloquently out of him.
I do believe some of that is
Bullshit.
planned for performance, because I can quote from a lot of things, and I do, but I never to the extent of people. I know, obviously, as a TV producer, and I've worked with a lot of presenters, the extent to which you pre-prepare things. So you can make people sound better than they are, but there are undoubtedly very learning people who can do that. Neil Innes, who we interviewed, the late great Neil Innes, for this, and it's a 2, and I became friends with, but this 2-hour interview that we did, you're not supposed to meet your heroes, right? But when you meet them, and they're so damn eloquent, and they know their stuff, they can quote from 1,000 sources, just like you're saying, and they turn a phrase. Everything is a quotable thing, and I really miss that.
Yeah.
And I used to sit at his feet, like, you know, disciple at the feet of Buddha, because every damn thing he said was worth quoting, you know. And he wasn't even the famous one from the Python group, you know, but he was incredible. They're all like that. Next week's episode, the next one is we're out on the 1st of every month. So the next episode is Mary Quant, sadly no longer with us. And that's a really interesting one, because she's talking very much about how the Beatles opened up society. She was famous just before them. So life was very dull, and she's trying to bring a bit of colour in. And then the Beatles come along, and everything's in colour. And she's not just saying them, she's talking about herself, she's talking about the actors and the films from the time as well. So that's very interesting. And then the final episode with an interview this year will be with Steve Van Zandt. Yeah. There's loads more Terry Gilliam if you go on Patreon. So it's worth subscribing.
Yeah, absolutely.
How to assume that a modern audience doesn't know how to interact with a podcast. I mean, you blatantly do, don't you? You know, it's literally...
It's like when you go on a plane and they tell you how to put the seatbelt on. It's like, if you haven't worked that out by now.
Yeah. I guess there's always a virgin on every flight. Most of it is covering yourself for legal reasons, I'm assuming, you know.
So for legal reasons, subscribe.
For legal reasons, subscribe. See you next time.